Picture this. March 1945, along the Rhine River in Germany. The war is nearly over, but the fighting is still brutal. German forces are dug in, waiting. They can hear it. The rumble of tanks, hundreds of them. The sounds of construction crews building pontoon bridges. The chatter of radio communications from two entire American divisions preparing to cross the river. 30,000 soldiers, ready to strike. The Germans adjust their defenses. They redirect their forces. They prepare for the assault. But here's the thing. There were no tanks, no bridges, no 30,000 soldiers. What the Germans were hearing, what they were seeing on aerial reconnaissance, what their spies were reporting, it was all a lie. An elaborate illusion created by just over 1,000 men, armed not with heavy weapons, but with rubber tanks, powerful speakers, and pure imagination. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the most successful con artists in military history, and their story was kept secret for over 50 years. January 20th, 1944. As the Allied forces prepare for the invasion of Europe, a unique military unit is activated, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But this isn't your typical combat unit. These men won't be carrying rifles into battle. Their weapons will be paintbrushes, sound effects records, and fake radio transmissions. The concept is simple, yet audacious. Make something small look enormous. Make a unit appear in one place when it's really somewhere else entirely. Deceive the enemy so thoroughly that they make fatal mistakes. The inspiration came from British deception operations in North Africa, where fake tanks helped win the Battle of El Alamein. But the Americans wanted to take it further. They wanted a mobile, multimedia deception unit that could travel the battlefield like a theater troupe, putting on different shows for different audiences. The architect of this wild idea? A celebrity journalist named Ralph Ingersoll, who had been the managing editor of The New Yorker and founded his own newspaper. Teaming up with West Point graduate Colonel Billy Harris, Ingersoll pitched the concept to the top brass. Incredibly, they bought it. But here's what made this unit truly special. The Army went looking for a very specific type of soldier. They didn't want hardened combat veterans. They wanted artists, designers, sound engineers, architects, men whose creativity could be weaponized. They recruited from art schools across America. The unit's average IQ was 119, one of the highest in the entire Army. Among the ranks were future luminaries who would become household names. Bill Blass, who would revolutionize American fashion. Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of the most important abstract painters of the 20th century. Photographer Art Kane. These weren't typical soldiers. They were creatives in uniform, and they had just 5 months to learn how to deceive an entire army. The Ghost Army was divided into 4 specialized units, each with its own role in the grand deception. First, the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. These were the visual artists. Their job? Create an army out of thin air. They had at their disposal something that sounds almost comical: inflatable tanks. But these weren't party balloons. They were sophisticated rubber decoys weighing 93 pounds each, built around a framework of inflatable tubes. When deflated, 4 men could carry one. When inflated with a gasoline-powered air compressor, they looked real from a quarter-mile away. The key was to make them imperfectly camouflaged. Too perfect, and the Germans would get suspicious. They needed to look real enough to fool aerial reconnaissance, but not so perfect that they seemed staged. It was art imitating life, imitating war. They could set up an entire phantom tank battalion in a few hours. Hundreds of rubber tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, even airplanes. They'd add finishing touches. Fake tire tracks in the mud, laundry hanging on clotheslines near fake bivouacs, freshly dug latrines. The Germans were looking for these details. The Ghost Army gave them exactly what they expected to see. Then came the sonic deception, led by the 3,132nd Signal Service Company. This was where things got truly innovative. Working with engineers from Bell Labs, they went to Fort Knox and recorded real armored and infantry units. The sounds of tank treads on different terrain, the rumble of engines, the clank of bridging equipment, even the voices of sergeants barking orders. These recordings were etched onto state-of-the-art wire recorders, the predecessors to tape. But recording was only half the battle. They needed to project these sounds across the battlefield. They mounted massive 500-pound speakers on half-tracks. These speakers were so powerful they could be heard 15 miles away. For each operation, they would mix different sounds to match their deception. Want to fake an armored column moving up? They'd blend engine sounds, track sounds, radio chatter. Want to fake bridge construction? They had recordings of pile drivers, welding torches, construction crews at work. The sound was so realistic it could trigger hallucinations. One soldier, knowing full well the tanks were fake, started seeing them because the audio was so convincing. The third element was radio deception, handled by the signal company Special. They created fake traffic nets with radio operators who could perfectly mimic the fist of other operators. Every radio operator has a unique style of sending Morse code, like a fingerprint. The Ghost Army learned to copy them. They'd impersonate entire divisions, sending fake messages about troop movements, supply requests, tactical orders. And finally, the 406th Combat Engineers provided security and added what they called atmosphere. This was pure theater. They'd paint fake unit insignia on vehicles. Soldiers would wear patches from divisions they were impersonating. They'd set up fake headquarters with MPs directing traffic. They even had officers dress up as generals from other units, driving through towns in jeeps where enemy spies might see them. One soldier later described it perfectly. "We were a traveling roadshow that went up and down the front lines impersonating the real fighting outfits." June 1944. Just weeks after D-Day, elements of the Ghost Army landed in France. Their first major test came near the beaches of Normandy. The Allies were building artificial harbors called mulberries, crucial for landing supplies. But these harbors were vulnerable to German artillery. The Ghost Army's mission: create a fake mulberry at night using lights to draw German fire away from the real harbors. It worked. The Germans shelled empty water while the real supplies flowed ashore. Next came Operation Brittany in September. The Americans were surrounding the fortified French city of Brest, but General Patton's forces were spread thin. The Ghost Army moved in to make the encircling force look much larger than it actually was. About 500 men pretended to be 8,000 soldiers from the 6th Armored Division. They set up their rubber tanks, blasted their sound effects, sent fake radio messages. German intelligence reported massive American forces. The defenders of Brest, believing they were surrounded by an overwhelming force, stayed put instead of attempting a breakout. But it was in Luxembourg where the Ghost Army would face one of its most dangerous missions. September 1944. The front line ran along the Moselle River. Patton's Third Army was preparing a major offensive at Metz, but needed to keep that sector of the front secure. The Ghost Army rolled into Luxembourg just 5 days after it had been liberated. Crowds lined the streets of Esch-sur-Alzette, cheering what they thought was a major combat unit heading to the front. They had no idea that the trucks were carrying inflatable tanks and sound equipment. The mission: impersonate elements of the 6th Armored Division and convince the Germans that this section of the front was heavily reinforced. Keep them from realizing how thinly held the American lines actually were. For 7 days and nights, the Ghost Army maintained the deception. They inflated hundreds of tanks, played the sounds of armored vehicles moving into position, created fake radio traffic. Soldiers would go into Luxembourg cafes wearing 6th Armored patches, talking loudly about their unit's strength, knowing enemy agents were listening. The danger was real. They were operating close to the front lines, often under artillery fire. The rubber tanks drew German shelling, but that was the point. Better to have the Germans waste ammunition on rubber than on real soldiers. Meanwhile, Patton's real forces repositioned for their attack on Metz. The Germans, convinced they faced a major armored force in Luxembourg, kept their reserves in place. When Patton struck, he achieved tactical surprise. But the Ghost Army's greatest performance was yet to come. March 1945. The war in Europe is entering its final weeks. The Rhine River stands between the Allies and the heart of Germany. Crossing it will require a massive assault, and the 9th Army is preparing to do exactly that. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops is given their most ambitious mission yet, Operation Viersen. The objective: make the Germans believe the 9th Army will cross the Rhine 10 miles south of where the real crossing will happen. To do this, the Ghost Army must impersonate not one, but 2 entire divisions, the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. That's roughly 40,000 men, with just over 1,000 soldiers. The Ghost Army deployed every trick they had learned. They set up more than 600 inflatable tanks and artillery pieces along the fake crossing point. They created elaborate fake headquarters. Their radio operators sent out massive amounts of traffic, simulating 2 divisions preparing for a river crossing. The sonic crews worked around the clock. At night, they played recordings of tanks and trucks rolling in, of troops setting up camps. During the day, they blasted the sounds of construction crews building pontoon bridges. They even attached real bridging units to add credibility, assembling actual bridge sections the Germans could see through binoculars. To complete the illusion, they set off flash canisters to simulate artillery fire. From across the river, it looked and sounded like a massive assault was being prepared. The Germans took the bait. Intelligence reports showed German forces converging across from the deception. They reinforced their defenses at the fake crossing point. They moved artillery. They repositioned troops. Meanwhile, miles upriver, the real 30th and 79th Divisions moved into position under absolute secrecy. They traveled only at night. Their artillery stayed camouflaged. They maintained radio silence. When they attacked on March 24th, the Germans were caught completely off guard. The divisions the Ghost Army had been impersonating met only disorganized resistance. Casualties were astonishingly low. Captured German intelligence maps from just before the attack showed the 79th Division exactly where the Ghost Army had portrayed it. They had completely lost track of the 30th Division. The 9th Army's intelligence officer later stated, "There is no doubt that Operation Viersen materially assisted in deceiving the enemy with regard to the real dispositions and intentions of this army." The 30th Division's intelligence officer put it more bluntly. The U.S. attack came as a complete surprise to the enemy with a consequent saving of American lives. 9th Army Commander General William Simpson issued a commendation to the 23rd. The careful planning, minute attention to detail, and diligent execution of the tasks to be accomplished by the personnel of the organization reflect great credit on this unit. The Ghost Army had pulled off the perfect con, and they had helped win the war. But this wasn't a game. The Ghost Army operated dangerously close to enemy lines, often within range of German artillery. They were armed with nothing heavier than .50 caliber machine guns. Their inflatable tanks couldn't protect them from real shells. March 12, 1945. Operation Buzonville, in the same region where they had worked before. The mission lasted only 33 hours, but it would be their costliest in terms of casualties. Captain Thomas Wells, a 29-year-old headquarters commandant from Manchester, Connecticut, was riding in a jeep when German artillery opened up. A shell hit near his vehicle. Wells was killed instantly. That same day, Staff Sergeant George Peddle from Philadelphia, a radio platoon sergeant, was in a convoy when it came under heavy shelling. Shrapnel tore through his radio truck. Peddle was mortally wounded. In total, Operation Buzonville cost the Ghost Army 2 killed and 15 wounded. These men died protecting a deception, maintaining an illusion that would save other soldiers' lives. Wells left behind a young daughter, Ruth, who would never know her father. Decades later, she would become instrumental in organizing reunions for Ghost Army veterans, helping to tell their story. These weren't the only casualties. Throughout their operations, 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed and dozens wounded. They received Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, and other decorations. But they couldn't tell anyone what they had earned them for. Because when the war ended, something extraordinary happened. The Ghost Army was ordered to remain silent. July 1945. The Ghost Army returned home to a hero's welcome. But they couldn't tell anyone what they had actually done. The unit was classified, top secret. The soldiers were sworn to secrecy. The equipment was quietly packed away. The records were sealed. For most of the men, their war stories had to remain vague. They could say they were engineers, that they served in Europe, but the details, the incredible deceptions they had pulled off, the lives they had saved, that had to stay locked away. Bill Blass went on to become one of America's most celebrated fashion designers. He would sit on his bunk during the war, sketching fashion designs in notebooks, dreaming of his post-war career. When asked about his military service, he would smile and say he had an interesting time, but couldn't elaborate. Ellsworth Kelly returned to art school, and his time with the Ghost Army, creating camouflage and deception, became a form of artistic training. He would become one of the most important abstract painters of the 20th century. But for decades, he told no one about his role in the deception. Many of the soldiers went back to art schools, forming networks that would help each other in their creative careers. But the bond they shared, the secret they carried, remained unspoken. Some families knew nothing. One soldier's stepson, Roy Eichhorn, knew his stepfather, George Martin, had been an Army engineer and photographer, but had no idea what he had photographed. It wasn't until decades later that Eichhorn discovered Martin had documented the Ghost Army's operations, capturing on film the inflatable tanks, the sonic equipment, the elaborate deceptions. The reasoning for the secrecy was strategic. If the tactics became public, they couldn't be used again. The Army wanted to preserve the possibility of using deception in future conflicts, so the story remained classified. For 50 years. It wasn't until 1996 that the Ghost Army's records were finally declassified. Suddenly, these elderly veterans could finally talk about what they had done. Some called their children, their grandchildren, finally able to explain their war. For the families, it was a revelation. They had known their fathers and grandfathers had served, but not like this. Not as artists who had saved thousands of lives with rubber and sound. As the story began to emerge, historians started to piece together the full impact of the Ghost Army's work. A military analyst who studied their missions in the 1970s, even while details were still classified, came away deeply impressed. Rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. The Ghost Army had conducted 22 major deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They had impersonated multiple divisions, including the 4th, 8th, 30th, 75th, 79th, 80th, 87th, 97th, and 95th Infantry Divisions, as well as the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Armored Divisions. Every time they set up their traveling roadshow, real combat units were able to move freely elsewhere. The Germans were always looking in the wrong place, at the wrong time, at phantom forces that didn't exist. Rick Beyer, a filmmaker and historian, became fascinated with the story. He created a documentary that premiered on PBS in 2013, bringing the Ghost Army's story to millions. He founded the Ghost Army Legacy Project, dedicated to ensuring these men would never be forgotten. In 2019, a bipartisan effort in Congress began to award the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. The bill was championed by veterans groups, the National World War II Museum, and members of Congress who believed these men deserved recognition. On February 1, 2022, President Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act into law, recognizing their unique and highly distinguished service in conducting deception operations in Europe during World War II. On March 21, 2024, the ceremony was held at the Capitol. By then, only 7 Ghost Army veterans were still alive. 3 of them attended, including 100-year-old Bernie Bluestein. Bluestein, looking at the medal, said his mouth was wide open. It's a thrill to have that honor. If you ask most of us, we never thought much about what we did. We did what we had to do in the war, and that was it. But it wasn't just that. What they did was revolutionary. They proved that creativity could be a weapon, that art could save lives, that sometimes the best way to win a battle is not to fight it at all, but to make the enemy fight shadows. Today, the Ghost Army's tactics are studied at military academies around the world. Modern psychological operations and information warfare units trace their lineage back to these artists in uniform. The inflatable tanks are displayed in museums. The wire recorders that captured those phantom sounds are preserved as artifacts. The paintings and sketches the soldiers created during quiet moments between operations are exhibited as both art and historical record. But perhaps the most important legacy is this. The Ghost Army changed how we think about warfare. They showed that victory doesn't always come from the biggest guns or the most soldiers. Sometimes it comes from outsmarting the enemy, from making them believe what isn't true. From 1944 to 1945, 1,000 artists convinced the German army that divisions existed where there were none. They created sounds that echoed across battlefields, illusions that fooled the most sophisticated intelligence networks of their time. They turned the battlefield into a stage, and they gave the performance of their lives. And because of them, thousands of real soldiers came home who otherwise wouldn't have. The Ghost Army, artists, actors, engineers, and architects who fought with imagination instead of ammunition, who wielded paintbrushes as weapons, who proved that in war, as in art, sometimes the most powerful thing you can create is an illusion. Their story was silent for 50 years. But now we know, we remember, and we honor the soldiers who won battles that never happened, who defeated an enemy that never saw them coming. Because they were ghosts, and ghosts, as the Germans learned, can be more terrifying than any real army.